Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, this video covers concerns about aid and understanding what they are. And this video could be 30 minutes long, it could be an hour long, it could be a documentary. It's just that the complexities of aid sort of go beyond the ability to totally comprehend the impact of giving or providing support to a developing nation. And while even with the best intentions, aid can create these outcomes for other places that were never intended. And one example, I was in the Peace Corps, and one story that floated around the Peace Corps was the one of the Peace Corps volunteers was in Africa, and they created a well, and the well was designed, of course, to improve the ability for villagers to get water. But what was lost by the creation of the well was an enormous amount of social connection that was made between the women of the community who before the well had gone down to a river, which was about a kilometer or two away, and spent the day down at the river washing clothes. And a couple years later, after the well was put in place, the fabric of the community, the people there started feeling like it was falling apart. And the result was that there was this lack of community time that was actually created by this trip to the river that the women did to wash clothes. So aid is extraordinarily complex. It's generally agreed that humanitarian aid is necessary and that it does have an important contribution in terms of like short-term suffering. But really, there is no convincing research that increased aid correlates to growth of GDP of a particular country. And much of that has to do with the actual countries themselves that are receiving the aid. And one little other story I have from my life was I was in Nicaragua, and right before we got to Nicaragua, there was a huge hurricane that came through. And the president, and it washed out these rivers, and the president washed out these bridges, and the president, in the end, ended up receiving, or the Nicaragua ended up receiving $100 million in reconstruction aid to rebuild the bridges and roads. And only about 30 million of it ever went to building bridges and roads. The other 70 million disappeared. And the president was later brought up on charges and found guilty. But like that money's never recovered. And so corruption in the receiving country and the recipient country can really have an impact on the overall outcome of the aid. So let's just look at some specific concerns that people have about aid. First of all, aid for political reasons. Tied aid versus untied aid. Tied aid equals a subsidy in another country. Food aid is bad in the long run. Increased dependency, increased income gap, and forced to accept certain economic policies. And this first one, aid for political reasons. I mean, it's almost impossible, actually, I think, to take political reasons out of any sort of aid that is given. And it's argued definitely that developed countries, tend to give aid to those countries that are of political or economic interest to them. And that sounds like a condemnation, but it's just logical. I mean, governments are in charge of taking care of their own people, and if they can give aid to a country that they know will provide them with some sort of market or provide them with increased political ties or is strategically located on the earth, it just sort of makes sense. But of course, that isn't necessarily helping the proper people. Another concern is tied versus untied aid. It's generally argued that tied aid is not as effective as untied aid, and it's mainly that the developing country is not able to look for the least expensive goods or services, but has to buy them from the donor country, which may be more expensive. Remember, tied aid means that you can have this aid, but you have to buy our goods. And secondly, tied aid creates no employment or extra output in the developing country, since no expenditure takes place there. The imports themselves may also replace domestic product, which of course is bad. And then they also will take a look at it as like tied aid in a way is really a subsidy, but the subsidy is in another country. So they're giving another country, instead of subsidizing their own particular market for, say, I don't know, corn, they're giving the money to a developing nation, but then forcing a developing nation to buy corn from say, the United States, who gave the aid. And so it's really just a subsidy for their own place. Next, food aid bad in the long run. While short-term provision of food is essential, my goodness, countries are not interested in having other people, populations starve, but long-term provision of large quantities of food may actually force down domestic prices and make matters worse for farmers. it might even be considered, to actually prevent the development of certain industries in a particular country as a result of this aid that's coming in. Of course, aid can and it's pretty difficult to argue against this one. I think continued dependency on aid may mean that there is little incentive to innovate, and that people develop a welfare mentality where they feel like they need this particular aid. There's an argument against aid in that it may increase the income gap between particular countries. Some say that aid is often focused on the modern sector, like on industrialization, which would help the developing nation, and this could cause a greater gap in incomes and living standards of those in the receiving country, because most developing nations, of course, a large portion of their population is still working in agriculture. And then lastly, and this is maybe the most controversial, I think, if you give aid, right, aid is only available oftentimes as a result of the host country agreeing to certain economic policies. And donors may argue that the aid will be effective if it is given to countries that adopt what's considered to be, quote, sound economic policies. And these often reflect the Washington Consensus, right? Policies that emphasize free markets, liberalization, deregulation, and privatization to promote economic growth. But oftentimes, it's really difficult for politicians who receive the aid to change the economic structure that they have in their particular country simply as a result of this demands from a foreign nation. If you're a politician in a developing nation and you have liberalized the economy and reduced tariffs, say, on one particular industry, and it leads to massive unemployment in a particular industry, or the destruction of a specific agricultural sector, like, how are you going to say to your people, like, oh, I know you're suffering because you can no longer sell your corn, but we have to have free markets because in the long run it's better for everyone? I mean, that's just not a really easy political argument to be made. Another thing, and I just take a look at the other things that Jocelyn Blink said here, that there is also a sense of aid wariness. In developing countries are just tired of giving aid to a particular place. But the other thing, and this kind of goes on to the next couple of videos, like loan aid creates debt, and loan repayments can become an enormous drain on the ability for developing nations to provide basic services to their people, education, healthcare, because they're spending so much of their government's budget on just repaying old debt. But then again, where's the heart, man? Come on, where's the heart? We can't forget that in the poorest countries, private investment is almost impossible. And so, and it's not that the people who need the aid the most are responsible for it. Usually it's the politicians or the history or colonialism or something that's created the conditions. So wars, an illiterate and uneducated workforce, corruption, lack of infrastructure makes it really hard for developing nations to attract international investment, private investment. And so oftentimes the only thing that countries might have an opportunity to receive is aid from governments, because obviously they don't need to turn a profit on it at all, really. So there you go. There's some concerns about aid. It's an incredibly complex topic. There's really no way out of it. It's impossible if you have a heart and you're in a developed nation not to want to promote economic development in another country. But the way in which that happens, the embedded difficulties cross-culturally, embedded difficulties politically, the embedded difficulties just in the intentions versus the outcomes, it really makes aid an extraordinarily complex topic. So there you go. I hope you found this video to be helpful. We'll talk to you in a bit.